Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Saturday's closing session at the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival 2021, titled Afghanistan the Long War. Today, we are privileged to feature David Loyn, an award-winning BBC journalist with many years of reporting from Afghanistan. He will be in conversation with the award-winning journalist Suhasini Haider, who is the diplomatic editor of the prestigious newspaper The Hindu. Welcome, both of you. They will be speaking about David's newly released The Long War, the inside story of America and Afghanistan since 9/11, whose pages, one review says, is steeped in tragic misinterpretation and always with a sympathy for ordinary people who deserved much better. This year's Khushwant Singh Literary Festival is themed The Second Becoming and opens the possibility to harness the impulse to change, to re-emerge better, to renew, to rebuild. And as Niloufar put it, when we think of Afghanistan, we can only hope for a second becoming. David Loyn and Suhasini Haider, Afghanistan the Long War. Over to you.
Hello and good evening, David. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I should start by saying that really The Long War is one in a long series of David's writing on Afghanistan. He wrote way back when he wrote about what he called Frontline, about reporting there. There's a fascinating history of Afghanistan called Butcher and Bolt. It's about 200 years, really, of foreign forces trying to be in occupation of Afghanistan, I should say. There was the shorter one in Afghanistan, and now there is the Long War. That really describes the last 20 years. Afghanistan post-2001, post-9/11, and particularly the very, very dubious history of the United States in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And, you know, the entire intervention that ended much like other wars waged by foreign armies in Afghanistan. Fierce fighting force still in power there, and the nation still mired, unfortunately, in poverty. So this book really chronicles the missed opportunities, all the left turns that the US and its allies took when they should have been turning right and the other way around. It also turns the spotlight on Afghanistan's leaders and how they failed really one by one to work and do what was needed just at that moment to change their nation's destiny. You know, critical years. I'm sure everybody has watched David on TV. I myself can remember his interventions, his reporting really from the subcontinent in the 1990s. He's been a foreign correspondent for more than 25 years, mainly with the BBC. He was, of course, the only foreign reporter with when the Taliban took Kabul in 1996. And then he had a very interesting vantage position, which I hope to talk about, which was as an advisor to the Ghani government on strategic communications for about a year. David, with that long introduction to the book, I was taken right at the beginning, where you make it clear, in a sense, you say that they didn't have a doctrine. The United States and its allies, the nations that went in post-2001, just didn't have a strategy. So in some ways, there is this idea that the outcome was preordained. That the day they entered Kabul in 2001, and of course you make the point that taking Afghanistan is easy. It is creating security within Afghanistan that is so difficult to do. So some would say that it was preordained. The day they went in was, in fact, it was quite clear that the US and other foreign forces would never be able to stabilize the country. On the other hand, as you have painstakingly detailed, there were many times when if the US, for example, had not taken that turnoff to Iraq, if the US had not tried to deal directly or deal only with warlords in the country, if the UK hadn't intervened at a certain time on peace talks with the Taliban. There's so many ifs that I think your book actually ends with. Which do you think it is? Was it a fate? I mean, was it a preordained outcome, or was it something that really could have been a different outcome?
Well, Suhasini, it's so good to talk to you, and such an honor to talk to the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival and to be with you all. Your point is very well made, that the lack of a sense of a doctrine of intervention, I think, really doomed this war from the Western point of view from the very beginning. Western armies have been used in the past. They quite like training with big bits of kit for what we call symmetrical warfare, for armies fighting each other across battles, the traditional battles of the past. But actually, those kinds of wars, on the whole, don't happen. You know, if America looked at its own history, it would train much more for these complicated national interventions in countries, because that tends to be the kind of warfare that America is engaged in for really most of the 200 years of its history. So when it came to Afghanistan after 9/11, the appalling attacks and the shock of America, and the inevitable military response that was going to come against the people who'd harbored Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, America didn't have the training, the capacity to really understand how to manage what they were trying to do in that country. So from the very beginning, it was improvised. And I think we saw the mistakes really before December 2001. I mean, I spent a lot of time in those early months traveling really mostly behind Tajik lines in the north of the country, the small part of the country that was not in Taliban hands before 9/11, and then traveling with Hazara forces to retake Bamiyan. And I was struck by the lack of international intervention on the ground. So what we saw was enormous American firepower, quite extraordinary sites that I saw. I was just north of Bagram when they were bombing the Taliban front lines quite close by. It looked, I mean, in a way, it looked like a kind of air show. It was plane after plane after plane with no stopping the American assault on the Taliban front line. So there was no doubt that they were going to win at the beginning in terms of defeating the Taliban. That wasn't very difficult to do. But the problem was that they then allied with people who in the past had in Afghanistan been seen as warlords and actually been seen to fail. Those Northern Alliance groups, Dostum, Massoud, Ismail Khan in the West, and others around the country, Hekmatyar in particular, were seen by the Afghans as having been heroes in some ways in the 1980s in defeating the Russians, but then turning against each other in this bitter civil war in the early 1990s that the Taliban originally emerged as a reaction to in 1996. So in 2001, when the Americans stood up those very people again, to many Afghans, it looked as if they had taken, if you like, the wrong side in a civil war. At least they'd taken a side in a civil war. And I don't think America quite understood that that's what they'd done in 2001. And the consequences took them really 2 decades to unravel. And if you look at at that policy on the ground at the end of 2001, what America was trying to do was to capture or kill Osama bin Laden and the senior Al-Qaeda people. That was the biggest priority that they had. And when he was cornered at Tora Bora in the first week of December in 2001, America had the capacity to send in US Marines. 2,500 US Marines were on board a ship, around 1,000 on shore already, available to be sent into war. And America didn't use them. Instead, they used two pretty unreliable local militia leaders to do the fighting on the ground. There were more international journalists at the Battle of Tora Bora than there were international troops in the first week of December 2001. And the consequences were working with those unreliable local militias, many of whom had been allied to Al-Qaeda until only recently. The consequences were that Osama bin Laden escaped, and it took another 10 years before they cornered him in Pakistan. So even in the terms of the war itself, the way that they went in with this light footprint on the ground was going to fail to deliver the consequences. And then after that, you saw in 2002, you saw these sort of contradictory policies emerging on the American side and with their allies. Of course, America was always the biggest player, but there were by the end more than 50 countries involved in the military alliance in Afghanistan, including Britain as the second largest contributor. But in 2002, they began to change the policy towards putting more troops on the ground, and at the same time, moving into this rather ill-defined notion of beginning to rebuild the infrastructure, $1 billion at the beginning, and then many more $1 billion that followed that. So the light footprint quickly changed into this rather contradictory sense of, well, perhaps we ought to try and build a democracy. But absent the doctrine that they needed of intervention, absent the capacity that they needed really to have to understand the political and social context of Afghanistan at the beginning, it meant that nation building policy that happened in the early years was always doomed to fail. And I think we saw, the reason why it became America's longest war was sown in those very early months, and because of the failure really to have any sort of sense of a doctrine of intervention, of a way of proceeding, when America inevitably, as it might do again in the future, might need to go into a country.
Certainly, and you put it very beautifully on the doctrine of intervention. But the truth is that the world has watched this for 20 years and still perhaps doesn't know why the US did what it did. Why was it the longest war? If it started out as let's get Osama, morphed into let's defeat the Taliban, became about ensuring there was no terrorism and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, went on to become let's now build a nation, let's pour in money, no, let's make a democracy, let's build a constitution instead, all of these things. But we do know that in 2011, the US then did find, as you said, cornered Osama bin Laden and killed him. Why didn't it stop there?
Well, because Afghanistan was still potentially a country that would harbour terrorists again in the future. And I think there was always this sense on the military side, and the military as well as I do, Suhasini, if they see a nail, the hammer is the army. I mean, that because that's what they've got. So they wanted to stay, they wanted to do the job. So there was a strong sense from the generals of, one last heave, let's give this, one last chance. And we saw that all the way through the war, really until President Obama began to set withdrawal deadlines and began to set conditions on the international troops, and around about the time that Osama bin Laden was killed in Abbottabad in Pakistan. But I think the paradox really of the American intervention, and the answer to your question as to there's these various contradictory senses of nation building, democracy, military effort that they put in. The paradox was that they were always wanting to leave quickly. And because they wanted to leave quickly, they ended up staying for a very long time. And what I mean by that is that if America had been willing at the beginning to say, look, intervention is complicated. It's very difficult to go into these countries and to try and make a change that is lasting. Maybe it'll take up to 10 years to provide the kind of stability that we would like to see before we leave. Well then, if they'd said we're willing to stay for up to 10 years, then they might have been out in 12 or 15. But that's the sort of duration that these things take. But because there was always a rush to the exits, ironically, people say America needed an exit strategy. That's what they lacked in Afghanistan. I think the problem was the opposite. They were always looking for the exit. They were always time limiting the effort that they put into the country. All the way through, there was a sense of, we'll only do this for this long. Conditions set on the troops, which were timetable led and not conditions led, before they would withdraw. So I think you had this, paradoxical situation where, because they wanted to leave quickly, they ended up staying for a very long time. And with this rather confused situation that emerged, that they were always wanting to get democracy on the ground without building the institutions that democracy requires. And I think that was a problem. It was a big problem in Afghanistan. It was a big problem in Iraq as well. You mentioned the distraction of Iraq that happened really quite quickly. Believe it or not, the American commander, and I discovered this in the research for my book, who was commanding CENTCOM for the attack on Afghanistan at the end of 2001, even before Kabul had fallen, he'd been asked to put together contingency plans to bomb Baghdad, to move on into Iraq. So the distraction began really 2 years before the actual war in Iraq happened in 2003. And from very, very early on, Afghanistan became, the other war. The Taliban were defeated. There'll be some sort of nation building project. The Europeans can do a lot of that. There was a very strong sense on the American side that let's let the Europeans do the nation building, but they didn't let the Europeans do the nation building. Instead, they were really keen on democracy, but without building the institutions, the tax base, the functioning civil service that democracy provides for. And they ended up, that's why the corruption emerged, which was the real cancer which ate away at the intervention in Afghanistan and ate away at the country, and in the end was the reason why the Ghani administration imploded in the way that it did this year, really because corruption had just eaten away at the heart of Afghan society. And the corruption emerged not just because the warlords that I mentioned were such an obstacle to the potential for any other sensible intervention, but also because the politicians who were elected were not accountable to their own electors. They were accountable instead to foreign donors, because the institutions that were there didn't raise their own taxation. There wasn't the tax base, there wasn't the sense of a functioning bureaucracy, of a functioning civil service, functioning administrative service of the sort that India enjoys. And so that democracy was a sort of sham. It was because the voters were not voting for people who were accountable to them in any sense. They were accountable instead to these outside players, to outside donors. And in a sense, you had the opposite of the American, the American ideal of no representation, no taxation without representation. You had the opposite of that. You had representation without taxation, which is this curious paradox that emerged in Afghanistan, which inevitably led to those who were elected being very corrupt and really preying on the people and taking as much of the money as they could to Dubai. I mean, so much of that international aid money ended up, in Dubai and in other Arab Emirates.
David, in fact, we're getting ahead of the story, if you like, because of course your book puts it very well in separate phases, 2001 to 6, and then to 9, and then to 11. And really the very interesting part is from 2015 to 2021, where you see, as you said, this the US wanting its very quick exit strategy, but ending up with just a series of quick exit strategies, none of which were very good. So I do want to ask, since you brought up that issue of corruption, but surely what the world saw was much more shocking than just about corruption at the top. You saw in a matter of days or moments, actually, the entire top leadership just disappear. The entire ANSDF, which every other military commander who had worked with them and people who had armed them felt they could actually withstand a lot more. You saw them disappear. So many people, and you've written in your book that you've written it for the new generation of Afghanistan, the new generation born and brought up after 2001. And yet that entire elite, educated, intellectual layer of Afghanistan also disappeared. Many of them, of course, clinging on to planes, having to leave the country in the worst possible circumstances. But what I'm trying to ask really is that why do you think I mean, corruption is one part of it, but why do you think that whole chimera, after all, when you say democracy, Afghanistan had 3 elections. Why did that entire thing just come down like a house of cards also suddenly?
Well, it was remarkable what happened this summer, and the events of August the 14th, 15th in particular. I mean, I think, I've heard a lot of stories from, as you mentioned, many of the elites have ended up abroad. Many of them are here in London, and I've met them since they've been here, and I've talked to other people who were there on the ground. And I think, I don't believe, by the way, the Russian story that President Ghani left in a plane loaded with dollars. I mean, that wasn't his style. And I don't believe that he was personally corrupt at the levels that people are talking about. There were certainly people very close to him and very senior in the Afghan palace who were corrupt. And I saw that when I was working in his office. But I think he still has to explain just why he left in the way that he did, because it clearly felt like quite a rehearsed departure. He left with his most senior staff on an aeroplane, having told other people in the office that he'd be back in the afternoon for meetings. So, I mean, he says, and he said in this rather curious statement he put out from his exile in the Emirates, he says that he was told by the palace security people that the Taliban were out to get him. But there are many people who I think won't forgive him quickly. Many people who had supported him until then for the way that he ran. And I think that it was difficult to understand, because there was a sense among many people that there was an opportunity for some kind of an interim government. And we saw former President Karzai, the former presidential candidate and chief executive of the country, Abdullah, who are still living, not openly, I would say, I mean, sort of under house arrest in Kabul at the moment, but not harassed by the Taliban. And still engaging with international media. Ex-President Karzai did a very interesting interview this week with the international media. So, whether it would have been possible for Ghani to have remained and to have, continued some kind of transitional relationship or arrangement with the Taliban, I don't know. But I've talked a lot about the events of that weekend, but I think before that, there was really a sense which is why one of the reasons why the Taliban were able to move in so quickly this year, a sense that this government was corrupt, was more corrupt than the Karzai government, that corruption had sort of eaten away, as I say, at the sort of heart of the administration, that all interactions that any Afghan had with the state involved some kind of payment, and the corruption meant that the senior jobs were in the hands of people who weren't properly appointed. There was a huge amount of patronage, different patronage networks that operated across the centre of the country, and I think so there is a brief relief, I think, in the Afghan countryside that government has gone, and of course the corruption also ate at the heart of the army. And although, we were told there were 300,000 Afghan troops, there weren't 300,000 Afghan troops. The incoming defense minister, who was appointed just a couple of months before the fall of Kabul in the summer, I was told by someone in his office that there were really only about 50,000 effective troops. Now, that would have been enough to hold the Taliban back if they'd been well organized and well coordinated at the center. But one of the problems of the Ghani administration actually was that in terms of security, they were quite sort of interventionist in the way that they moved people around, rather than letting the army take the professional decisions that it wanted to do to protect the country. And by the time they put key commanders, good commanders like Sami Sadat, who'd defended Helmand rather successfully, until just the week before Kabul fell. By the time they then moved him into a more senior position and allowed him, in a sense, to try and reorganize special forces to defend Kabul, it was all too late, and the Taliban were at the gates, and the whole thing collapsed. And I think the Afghan army in the end just took off their uniforms and went home, to some relief in the Afghan countryside. And I think the Taliban certainly do have a moment of relief when people say, well, at least the fighting stopped, at least the bombing stopped, we're not being killed anymore. But that's going to be very brief, because the amount of challenges that they have, there's no money in the economy, there's enormous poverty, hunger really, for 15 to 20 million people who will require food aid this winter, and a pretty bleak sort of outlook for the Taliban if they don't significantly sort their administration out quite quickly. And it doesn't look as if they're doing that. We've seen the structure of the government that they put in place is not one that lends itself to the international community thinking, well, this is an administration that we can do business with, because we saw the head of Pakistan's ISI, after 2 weeks of argument between different Taliban factions, they didn't have an administration in place to go into power quickly when the country fell. They organized the fall of the government, but they didn't have an administration to replace them. We saw the head of the ISI go in to bang heads together and try and impose some sort of order on the Taliban government. But the order that Pakistan imposed was entirely led by the Haqqani network, their biggest clients in Afghanistan. And the Haqqani network have been responsible for most of the big terrorist attacks in the last few years. They've killed hundreds and hundreds, thousands of Afghan civilians. I haven't killed very many foreigners. They've killed thousands of Afghan civilians, and people are very aware of that in Afghanistan. So I think both in internal terms and in international terms, the Taliban have not done anything to satisfy anybody, or to try and build some sense that they would be, a different sort of administration. And that, in some ways, goes to justify the actions that former President Ghani took in running away in the way that he did. That maybe there was no dealing with this administration, there was no possibility of an interim administration. His time had come to just leave, and that's what he did.
Right, and it's interesting because just 2 weeks before the August 15th, the developments, President Ghani was in Tashkent. I interviewed him at the time, and he couldn't have looked more in charge and aware of the situation. He said, my nation needs a commander-in-chief, and for the moment, I am going to be that commander-in-chief. I'm not going to run away. They sounded like anti-prophetic words. Now, I want to take apart a little bit of what you've just said. You spoke firstly about Sami Sadat, the general who then came in too late to guard Kabul. He wrote about what went wrong. And he said that essentially, it wasn't just a question of trying to shift the blame. He essentially said, look, when you took away all the American gadgetry that helped us with operations, whether it was the drones, whether it was surveillance, whether it was intelligence, which the Americans began to do quite early in the game. You took away our eyes and ears, in a sense, about where we should be attacking. When the contractors were pulled out, American contractors were pulled out of the US, out of Afghanistan, once again, the ANSTF was left blind. And the basic point that the US entered into the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, essentially, in a sense, making the Taliban, in an interlocutor, almost saying that the Taliban had a right to rule in Afghanistan. Obviously, they didn't say they had the unique right to rule, but they felt that the Taliban should be a part of the government. Mr. Biden himself has said since then that he spoke to Mr. Ghani on 3 occasions and tried to tell him, let the Taliban into the government. Now, if that is in fact the case, then doesn't so much of this blame for the collapse of the military in Afghanistan really lie at the door of the US? In a sense, with the Taliban coming to power, the US got what perhaps it was negotiating for, what Zalmay Khalilzad was talking about for 2 years before that.
Yes, and well, as you know, Zalmay Khalilzad, the negotiator, just left office yesterday, and promises in the days to come to talk about what happened in some detail. I think he had an extraordinary challenge when he was told by President Trump to negotiate a withdrawal deal, because that's really what Trump wanted. I think in the couple of years before that, interestingly, in the early years of the Trump administration, the Trump policy suggested to him by his then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis was quite a good one. It was a sound one. It was really to put a lot of military pressure on the Taliban, which the Americans did quite successfully, without then a timetabled withdrawal. For the first time, Trump said, well, look, just do the job as long as you can. But then only a year later, unsurprisingly for Trump, I suppose, he changed his mind and said to Zalmay Khalilzad, no, we need to negotiate a deal, and we need to negotiate it quickly, ideally for him before the election last year, for a full withdrawal. That's really what he wanted. I think Zalmay Khalilzad, to an extent, did what he could do in those circumstances with that hand of cards. But you're right. The one thing that he did do, and America did, which really outraged the Ghani administration, and I saw this with him myself when I saw him, was to give the Taliban some legitimacy in Doha. The Americans were negotiating with the Taliban without the Afghan government in the room. And it could be that the Afghan government might have been a bit savvier. They might then have sort of set up a parallel room in Doha themselves and been close to the talks and at least tried to engage, but instead they sort of skulked in their tents, and the Afghan elite ignored the negotiations in I think quite an unhelpful way, actually, for quite a long time, until in the end there was this withdrawal deal, because that's what it was. It wasn't a peace deal. It was a deal for American troops to withdraw from the country if and all of the conditions that were imposed on the Afghan government to release Taliban prisoners and on the Americans for troops to withdraw were hard conditions, if you like. And all that the Taliban had on their side were quite soft promises, that the Taliban would no longer be an international threat. They would no longer have any links with Al-Qaeda. So I think it wasn't a good deal. And then when President Biden came in January of this year, he wanted a complete end to the war, and he wasn't going to take anything from any of the generals, and many American generals, including the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, and other senior leaders were very strongly saying earlier this year, we don't have to leave. We don't have to abide by the terms of the Trump deal. The Taliban have not completely adhered to all of their elements in it. Let's just give it time, keep the troops there. And crucially, as you say, you mentioned Sami Sadat's very strong New York Times piece where he talked about the loss of the support that the Afghan forces had, not just in terms of American soldiers advising them, but in terms of the software that they had in order to keep up with their troops, the contractors who kept the aeroplanes in the air, all of these other enablers that really kept that by now quite sophisticated modern army going, went when Joe Biden pulled out the last 2,500 American troops. So behind those 2,500 American troops was this enormous capacity for the Afghan forces. But one of the elements in my book, actually, I spend a lot of time talking to people in the White House in the first year who were there in the first year of the Obama administration, 2009, when again there were decisions as to whether they should leave or whether they should stay, whether they should increase troops, as they ultimately did in 2009-10. And the strongest voice in the room back in 2009 for leaving, or leaving just a few troops in Afghanistan, was Joe Biden. And alongside him was Antony Blinken, who's now his Secretary of State. Jake Sullivan was also a senior player in those negotiations. So I think Biden had heard the generals before saying the kinds of things that they were saying this year. And when he went in 2009, because they had very strongly argued then that they wanted more troops in Afghanistan for longer, and he wasn't going to have it this year, and he pulled out, and I think he pulled out with some haste, frankly, without holding on to Bagram Airport, without properly consulting his allies, very significant bruises still across NATO, open comments by both the British Defence Secretary and, interestingly, the head of the army, saying that this was not the decision that they wanted and it wasn't done in the way that they wanted. Quite interesting criticism, really, of Britain's closest ally. So I think America, this year under Biden, in terms of the way that they left, and in the last couple of years under Trump, in the way that they legitimized the Taliban, and as you say, in a sense, really sort of anointed the Taliban as the next government of Afghanistan. I think those were some pretty bad mistakes made at the end of the war.
Sure. And another part of what you were speaking about, and of course, I've seen that you quoted from Carlotta Gall's book, and she has written about how this was really the wrong war. You said the ISI chief was there in Kabul at the Serena, drinking a cup of tea, trying to say no problem in the government, as if he was going to ensure that it would be all right. Of course, more repercussions of that in Pakistan now. And we also see the US turn in 20 years. I mean, in 2001, the US went to the United Nations, changed around the UN Security Council protocol, put all these 135 Taliban leaders on a terrorist watch list. 20 years later, or 17 years later, as the talks began, the US not only said they had found these Taliban people who were on the designated list in Pakistan, not to mention Osama bin Laden himself, for which Pakistan didn't seem to get too much flack from the US, that not only had they found them there, that they were not going to, in fact, punish Pakistan for giving them safe haven, but in fact were going to urge Pakistan to help them bring the Taliban to the table for talks. I know that this is a lot of what we are discussing is in hindsight, but is there an understanding in the West, in the US, in the UK, that they really fought the wrong war for all those years?
Well, this is you mentioned Carlotta Gall's book, The Wrong Enemy. It was originally a quote from Richard Holbrooke, the first AFPAC representative. We're fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong country. And for him, he thought, and Holbrooke thought by 2009-10, when he was appointed, that he'd seen enough, that Pakistan had clearly, supported the Afghan Taliban openly. By those years, you could see that had happened, right from the very beginning. And I think America's policy towards Pakistan has been very contradictory. The spine of my narrative, the main interviews in my book, The Long War, were with the senior military commanders during the combat years, 8 rather remarkable individuals. And all of them spoke about how, while they were commanding in Afghanistan, this extraordinary job with a 50-nation alliance, dealing with President Karzai, then President Ghani, dealing with this complicated country, and at the peak 150,000 international troops. It was a very, very big 4-star role. And all of them said that while they were in office, they could see Pakistan and what they were doing. There was on one occasion there was an American major ambushed while negotiating with the Taliban, with the Pakistani border guards, and shot dead. There were some terrible incidents like that all the time, and they could see, Pakistani border guards letting, Taliban cross the border. On one occasion, there were Pakistanis who were shooting at American special forces at night when they were in operation in Afghanistan, not on the Pakistani side of the border. And America responded to that, in fact, by destroying a Pakistani border post. Just once there was this really strong military retaliation. But while they were in office, none of them, of course, could say any of this publicly. It was only after they were in office. So the public view of America always was that destabilizing Pakistan, and this remains American policy, destabilizing Afghanistan always felt like a bad thing to do because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and the last thing that anybody outside the region, and frankly, I think inside the South Asian region wants, is an unstable Islamist country in control of nuclear weapons. So, you know, America has a long-term alliance with Pakistan and was wanting to retain good relations with Pakistan during the war because they were relying on it to in order to be able to cross the border with material. There was huge amounts of material landing in Pakistan by sea and then coming into Afghanistan. And even, I mean, during long periods, the borders were closed because Pakistan was punishing America for this, that, or the other infraction. And despite that, you know, America never put the pressure on Pakistan that I certainly think India would have wanted it to do. And as you say, even after Osama bin Laden was found living very close to, you know, all of the very senior elements in Pakistani military. So, you know, and the source who gave the Americans the intelligence as to where he was imprisoned by Pakistan. So I think, you know, and from an international point of view, and you know, this is obviously between India and Pakistan. I mean, I know the sensitivities in the region, but from an international point of view, I think Pakistan has certainly had a very easy ride in the last 20 years with huge amounts of international aid still going in, while they were openly supporting the Afghan Taliban and are now in quite a strong position. But let's see what happens going forward, because this Taliban administration is not stable. It's not as stable an administration as it was in the late 1990s. It doesn't have the same justification, interestingly. In the late 1990s, they emerged after a terrible civil war. This time, they emerge after a period of, you know, there's been fighting going on in Afghanistan, but a period of significant social progress. In many ways, Afghanistan is an alien nation to the Taliban. It's not a country that they are familiar with, a place where women, not just in the cities, but in the countryside, have expectations that are completely different from the expectations that the Taliban, you know, think that women should have. So I think it's going to be a very difficult, you know, time for the Taliban. It doesn't feel as if it's going to be a stable administration that's going to last forever. And I think Pakistan has huge challenges as to how it manages that, particularly because Pakistan has gone the whole way in going for the most extreme, you know, terrorist individuals to have the most senior positions in the Afghan government. And I think that's going to be, in the months and years to come, quite a challenge actually for the Islamabad government.
Yeah, in a sense, Pakistan owns the problem because of their proximity to the Haqqanis. And you would have seen just 2 days ago the horrific visuals of Sirajuddin Haqqani at the Kabul Intercontinental meeting with the families of suicide bombers, glorifying the act of the suicide bombers. And there is no way that this is not going to, I presume, stick to Pakistan in a sense. And you've got many fascinating details. I won't give them all away to the viewer of just the kind of duplicity we saw in so many parts of Afghanistan, which has brought it to this situation. But I think the point you just made is really important, that the Taliban has taken over after a period of 20 years of relative progress on issues of development, on issues of education, on issues of women's empowerment, unlike in the past. Another question I did really have for you is, why is it that even when the Russians left, in a sense, and nobody can really compare the kind of, you know, money or manpower that the US put into Afghanistan over the past 20 years. When the Russians left, despite not having made all of those, you know, all that kind of an investment, the government they put in power was able to more or less manage for at least 5 years. Here, the government didn't even last 5 hours. Why do you think that was?
Yes, and I mean, you know, Suhasini, a good friend of mine, a British general, was just sort of saying in saying to me in some sort of despair, I suppose, really, you know, as they do a sort of lessons learned sense in Afghanistan, he said, well, you know, how could we not have done as well as the Russians? And I think that the fact that that Russian government lasted, yes, for 3 years, and from 89 to 92, until the Mujahideen, you know, finally pushed them out. And then only really because Russia had collapsed and Russian aid stopped. The international aid would have continued to the Ghani government. It was continuing to flow in billions of dollars. But I think that's, you know, that's one of the key lessons that is going to be a real challenge to people. And my hope really for Western powers, you know, my own country, the United States, you know, those European powers who are still engaged in sort of interventions around the world, France in particular, and engaged in several countries in Africa, Mali in a very big way just at the moment. You know, my hope is that the lessons are properly learnt from Afghanistan, that people don't just turn away and go back to training for symmetrical warfare, which is the inevitable sort of demand of the military to say, we're never going to get involved in these kinds of things again. You know, I think they probably are. And I think learning the right lessons would properly honour the sacrifices of those who fell, because it's quite hard to, you know, get any solace out of this. You know, this was a defeat for the West, a very significant military defeat, and a defeat really for Western power, for Western involvement, for the capacity of the United States to, you know, and then many people in India might be cheering that, you know, America is no longer going to act as the world's policeman. But I think a world where, you know, where the democratic West does not, you know, engage in a positive way in countries around the world, sometimes with military force, you know, would be a worse world. You know, a world where Russia and China, you know, were the key international interlocutors setting the rules, which, you know, increasingly Russia and China there's a conference going on today in Russia with senior Taliban leaders, with a whole
which India is a part
of regional countries indeed. And so I think, you know, I think there is a new reality in South Asia with a very weakened and humbled United States, frankly, more humbled actually. I mean, this feels to me like quite a significant historical turning point, the 15th of August, 2021, in terms of American power internationally, and in terms of the ratcheting towards the Chinese century. And I think, you know, we have to think about the right kind of lessons in the West in order to be able to do these kinds of things better, in order to wield the sort of support that I think Western democracies feel that they should do. And I think the peoples of the world would be better if we did.
And you made that point about India, and obviously that's the subject for another discussion. But I think in India, there is a real worry that if on India's West, the kind of security threat has just ratcheted up as much as it has because of the US pullout and the manner of the US pullout, then really what kind of guarantees can India take for what is going to follow clearly in its east as the US gets involved more and more?
Absolutely.
In the Indo-Pacific?
There are obvious challenges in the Quad in terms of and America's wanting to turn towards the east. But I think it's always, even when the Quad was meeting in Washington recently, it was really interesting, you know, the first real talks that they held after the UN General Assembly. I thought it was really interesting that Joe Biden was pulled back once again to talk about Afghanistan, which he didn't want to do.
Correct. David, I could keep speaking to you about your book. And of course, as capitals around the world do this soul searching that you were speaking about, I don't think there's a better book than The Long War to help them with that journey. But there are a lot of questions that I have received. Some of them deal with the idea of, in fact, two of them I have asked, is there anything good about the Taliban? Is there anything new that you see about the Taliban? Has it changed at all? And can there be any positive outcome now?
I think there was a lot of, frankly, misplaced optimism, sort of false hopes on the part of the West in particular, but some other countries in the world, that somehow the Taliban would be different because we'd seen them in Doha negotiating. We'd somehow seen a different sort of face from the Taliban. And I never knew where that came from because there's no sign that they were going to be any different. In fact, in many ways, Taliban 2.0 is sort of worse than they were before. The Haqqanis have their capacity to operate, far more strengthened than they did before. You mentioned this extraordinary event yesterday, the day before in Kabul, where the families of suicide bombers were given compensation and sort of greeted as great heroes of the nation. And I think that, that kind of iconography, that sort of sense of a nation is not something that, that the Taliban are going to be able to build, confidence within their own country or outside the country. So I think they face formidable challenges. There's no sense that they have the capacity to operate the relatively sophisticated country that Afghanistan has become. I think the two big differences between Taliban 1.0 when they came in the mid-90s and now, number one, they don't have the same justification, that they're not coming in off the back of a civil war to sort of end the destruction, terrible destruction of Kabul. The first time I went to Kabul in the mid-1990s, we had to sleep in the basement of the house with a shovel, just in case a random rocket came in the night and destroyed the house. There were random rockets, people were murdered. The BBC producer was taken out of his car, targeted and murdered by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's people in Kabul in 1994. And that kind of destruction, the Taliban came as a sort of relief to that. And they came into a country that that wasn't sophisticated, that had been broken by civil war, where, their sort of tribal values were not completely unacceptable. They were pretty unpleasant in the cities, in Herat in particular. But now it's different. Now Afghanistan has been, a much more progressive country, much more sophisticated country, and they don't have anything like the capacity that they need in order to govern that country. So I think how they fall is really the challenge, and what the international community do in terms of building some sort of alternative so that perhaps there could be, after the fall of the Taliban, which will come, and let's see if we can keep Pakistan out of it this time, that there'll be something that will come without necessarily a big conflict.
Certainly, and those two questions were from Una in London and then Bharat in Malaysia. There's one more, just to the point that you just made. What should India's approach really be to the Taliban in particular, since India stayed out of engaging with the Taliban thus far? Their furtive moves, even the appearance of an official delegation in Moscow for this Moscow format meeting. But India has by and large stayed away. What should India do?
Well, India, of all the countries in the world, I think India has possibly lost more than many others. I mean, India's had such, friendships and investments in Afghanistan over the last few years. I mean, I remember when the Afghan parliament was being built, going to the building site, and there were these big sort of Sikh, foremen with Afghan builders, working on the ground in a really constructive way to try and literally build Afghan democracy. And that sort of investment and that people-to-people contact that India has had with Afghanistan, the very long-term, human relationships, of course, will remain. But I think India has enormous challenges. I mean, look, talking to the Taliban feels inevitable in some way. That doesn't mean recognizing them as the legitimate administration of the country. And I think it's been really interesting this time that no countries have yet recognized the Taliban. The three countries, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, who did recognize them last time, have stayed away for now. So I think there's, the international community are still biding their time, and India has, I guess, some advantages in that. But in order to protect investments, in order to support those people-to-people contacts, in order to, potentially, neutralize as much as India can the, enormous influence of Pakistan. Clearly, some sorts of negotiations, some sorts of discussions with the Taliban feel, even if it's only in regional forums, feels like something that I think India, would lose out if they didn't engage in.
Understood. That was from Samina in Chennai. And of course, you spoke about what India has lost in terms of its friends. And I know that you lost a colleague last month, Rahimullah Yousafzai, somebody, a journalist many of us have worked with, whose knowledge of the region was very vast. And there is a question here from Suman in Hyderabad asking, so what was your most heartwarming or heartbreaking experience in your time in Afghanistan?
I should just say, you mentioned Rahimullah Yousafzai, who was a good friend of mine, and in fact he was the reason that I was able to enter Kabul with the Taliban in 1996. We used to travel together a lot in those days, and of course he was the only journalist that Mullah Omar would ever speak to, and he never lost his complete independence as a correspondent and ability to operate across all sides. And I learnt a huge amount from him. He was a gentleman and a great influence, actually, in a sense, in interpreting Afghanistan to people like me, Westerners who came and really didn't know anything about the country. I love this question, though. Thank you for the question. What's my most heartwarming experience in Afghanistan? I've traveled all over the country, and the memories of those chaikhanas, the places you stay where they'll pull out a wonderful sort of fried foods, and sometimes grilled quail, which is a real specialty in the countryside in Afghanistan, or fish from the river, and then you roll out the mats on these brick floors with a carpet over the top, which have got a fire burning underneath, and sleep for the night where you've eaten. And just those kinds of the camaraderie and friendship of people everywhere you go in that very rugged countryside. But I guess my most heartwarming sort of memories are of the extraordinary nature of the oral culture. People recite poetry at a moment's notice, and they're quite regarded for it, even at quite formal events. I mean, last time I was in Afghanistan actually was for the second inauguration of President Ghani in March of last year, when I was invited by his staff, because I'd known them very well when I'd worked there a couple of years before. And even at that event, people would leap up in the middle of the audience and recite a few lines of poetry to enormous acclaim from everyone around them. And there are poetry phonings there are whole radio programs, devoted to people reading or reciting their own poetry. And I think a land that has such a sort of poetic soul and an oral culture of that quality is a country that deserves our enormous respect. The Afghan people, deserve far better, I think, than history in the last 40 years has delivered to them.
And I know that's something you do repeat often, that Afghanistan deserves better. David Loyn, it's been just such a pleasure. For those of you who have been wondering why the book is called The Long War, it's from the Sun Tzu saying, only one who knows the disastrous effects of a long war can realize the supreme importance of rapidity in bringing it to a close. So maybe we've seen at least this chapter close, but hopefully the longer war for Afghanistan will end for the Afghan people as well at the earliest. David Loyn, thanks so much. I'm going to hand back to our organizers at the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival now.
Thanks so much, Suhasini.
Thank you so much, David, Suhasini, for this beautiful and erudite and in-depth analysis of US engagement in Afghanistan. It highlights the tragedy of Afghanistan and the current painful realities of this land with a poetic soul. You talked us through the lack of a US doctrine of intervention, the failure to build institutions of democracy, the corruption, and the reasons why this corruption has just blossomed and exploded. Talked about how one conceives of the end of Western power. But really we take with us the idea of the land of the poetic soul. Thank you. Thank you very much.